Vodafone is the second largest mobile network operator in the Netherlands with around 4.9 million customers. It is part of the Vodafone Ziggo Group, which is a joint venture between Vodafone and the provider Liberty Global. In today's video I will talk about their masts and the typical deployments on the masts that you see in the Netherlands with regards to antennas and frequencies and so on. Let's start off with the spectrum that Vodafone owns, because that's crucial to their deployment. So they have 2x10 MHz on the 800 MHz band, which is used for 4G services exclusively, using the EAR FCN of 6300. Then on 900 MHz they have 2x10 MHz again, and that is used entirely for 2G at the moment. A bit surprising there isn't any 3G operating on that band. Then on 1800 MHz they have 2x20 MHz, which is used exclusively for 4G on macro cells using the EAR FCN of 1500. Then on 2100 MHz they have 2x20 MHz, but it's split across two blocks in the uplink and downlink direction, which makes things a little bit more complicated, but it's used either for three 3G carriers, so 10564, 10588 and 10612, with one of the blocks of spectrum on each direction not being used, or they refarm most of that to 4G and have a 10 MHz 4G carrier on EAR FCN 50 and keep one 3G carrier 10612. In the refarm configuration, those last blocks of spectrum are also not used. Finally, for 2600 MHz they have 2x30 MHz, and this is either used for 2x10 MHz of 4G on EAR FCN of 2800 or 2x20 MHz with EAR FCN of 2850. They don't currently use all of the spectrum for 4G. Vodafone Netherlands also do have a bit of 1900 MHz spectrum, but it isn't used as far as I'm aware. So let's move on to our first mast setup. This is a fairly low capacity one as the Netherlands go. So it's got 2G 900, 3G 2100 and 4G 800 using dual band Kathrein antennas. So the 800 and 900 MHz are diplexed together, and then there's just an MHA on the 2100 MHz, so it's all fairly straightforward. The next setup has a similar amount of spectrum on it, but with 2600 MHz using the 10 MHz paired carrier instead of the 800 MHz in the previous example. This mast uses the fairly standard Vodafone Netherlands configuration of two dual band Kathrein antennas, one which is a dual low band antenna and one which is a dual high band antenna, but clearly these aren't being used to their full capability, as we'll see later on in the video. So the 2G 900 MHz goes in two of the ports of the low band Kathrein antenna, and then you have 2100 and 2600 MHz going into the ports of the dual high band antenna. No diplexed here because it's a dual high band antenna. The masted amplifiers are just about visible behind the dual high band antenna in this example. The next mast example is a little bit strange as far as Vodafone Netherlands builds go. So this uses a triple band Huawei antenna with two low ports and four high ports. It has 2G 900, 3G 2100 and then 4G 800 and 4G 1800 MHz on it. The 800 and 900 MHz are diplexed into those two low ports, and then 1800 MHz 4G and 2100 MHz 3G go into the separate high band ports on the antenna. But as I said, this isn't a particularly common setup. Huawei antennas I did not see. I think this was the only Vodafone Netherlands setup I saw which had Huawei antennas on it actually. So a bit of an odd one in that regard. The next setup carries the same frequencies, but it looks very different, and that's because it's using Ericsson's active antennas. Vodafone in the Netherlands use Ericsson as their radio access network vendor throughout the country, and quite commonly they use Ericsson's active antennas, which are typically called AIRs. This build example uses fairly standard dual low band Kathrein antennas that are passive, combined with the Ericsson AIR 21s. The low band Kathrein antenna has the 800 and 900 MHz fed into it separately. Meanwhile, the Ericsson AIR 21 has 1800 MHz going in passively into it and 2100 MHz going in through the active remote radio unit inside the panel. This build goes a step further, and carrying the same frequencies, it uses a pair of Ericsson AIR active antennas. The longer one is an AIR 11, which carries the 2G 900 MHz through its passive ports and the 4G 800 MHz through the inbuilt remote radio. The second panel is an AIR 21, and it works in much the same way as the previous setup, so it has 1800 MHz going in through the passive ports and 2100 MHz through the remote radio. All of these setups so far have 2100 MHz as 3G, at least at the time that I made this video, but the final build has 2100 MHz 4G as well, and also 4G 2600 MHz. So this mast has all of the mainly deployed Vodafone Netherlands spectrum. So 2G 900 MHz, 3G and 4G 2100 MHz, and then 4G on 800, 1800 and 2600. And this was using the 2x20 MHz of 2600 MHz as well. A thing to notice about this site is it looks rather similar to a number of the sites we've seen before. So it uses a dual low band Kathrein antenna on each sector, and then it has the dual high band Kathrein antennas as well. The low band side looks fairly similar to normal, with the 800 and 900 MHz being fed in as we've seen before. The 1800 MHz has dedicated ports, so it just goes straight in. Meanwhile, the 3G, 4G 2100 and 4G 2600 are diplexed together into their ports. Now clearly these are only a few sites, however I found, as with the other networks in the Netherlands, that there aren't a great variety of different mast configurations compared to the UK, where there's just absolutely tons, which obviously is very sensible because fewer builds makes it easier to scale and means that you can mass purchase things and requires less training and so on. Thanks for watching this video about Vodafone Netherlands. I've been meaning to make this video for about a year now, but I've just got really busy and just kept putting it off. But I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you on the next video. You're on the wrong side of the camera to perhaps see it, but it is quite a nice sunset out here tonight. Nice orange sky.